All right, welcome back to this series of mini lectures on the 2020 US election Facebook studies. In this second episode, we will be looking at two papers, both authored by Andrew Guess and many co-authors, and both published in the same issue of Science on social media and the elections. Both of these papers are experimental studies where Andrew Guess and co-authors look at the effects of disabling one of the algorithms of the Meta platform, so Facebook and Instagram, on especially polarization. So the first paper on social media feed algorithms, they look at the difference between people who have the normal algorithmic feeds and a reverse chronological feeds. The idea here is that often it is worried that the Facebook algorithm promotes the kind of news that is extra likely to lead to polarization because it likes conflict, it likes scandal, it likes making sure people are engaged with the platform. So disabling the algorithm and giving people a chronological feeds might mean that they are less polarized at the end of the election campaign. The second paper has the same idea, but rather than the algorithm here, it is the resharing function. So the idea there is that one of the problems with Facebook and other social media platforms is often said to be the reshare. So the idea that people don't just post things, but that through resharing something can suddenly go viral, and especially those viral items are probably, so is the reasoning, the ones that are likely to lead to polarization, again, because they are more likely to be reshared and boosted, because they are more negative, because they are more engaging, because they maybe also incur more negativity or hate or negative emotions. Both papers follow more or less the same setup. So the research question in both cases is whether disabling this affordance of the Facebook or Instagram affects the engagement with the platform, and especially also affects the polarization at the end of the experimental periods. Both were pre-registered experimental setups with in the 20,000 range participants who all consented to be part of the experiments. So Facebook invited, I guess, all of the US adult Facebook users, and out of this group, 23,000 or 21,000 agreed to participate in the experiments. The intervention periods lasted from end of September until mid-December, so including the presidential elections the 3rd of November. And the idea here is that there's an experimental group, and the experimental group did not receive the algorithmic feed, they received the chronological feed, or the experimental group did not receive any reshares compared to the control group, which had the normal Facebook experience. Right, so let's first look at the effect of disabling the algorithmic feed. So what happens with your Facebook experience if rather than getting the algorithmic feeds, you get a reverse chronological feed, so you see everything that has been posted by the people you follow in reverse chronological order, so the newest ones on top. This is especially interesting at the moment, this question, because in the European Union, the new directive has decreed that you should be able to disable your algorithm, so you should have control of the algorithm yourself, and there are options to disable your algorithm in both Facebook and Instagram, but of course they've made it as difficult as possible. So in the Netherlands they were actually sued by a non-profit called Bits of Freedom, and the judge has ordered Facebook to make it easier to disable your algorithm. So the question is, does it actually help to disable your algorithm? Does it make sense that the European Union has decreed that Facebook should allow you to disable your algorithm? So let's look at what it does. At the top left, we can see the average percentage difference in time spent in the experimental group or in the control group versus the US monthly active users. So what you see here is that in blue are the people who received the chronological feeds, and in yellow are the people who received an algorithmic feeds. And what you can see here is that clearly the people with the algorithmic feeds spend more time on Facebook than the people in the experimental group. And you see the same in Instagram, although the effect is slightly smaller, but also here you see that the people that receive a chronological feed spend less time on the platform than people that receive the normal Instagram experience. What is also really interesting from this graph is that you can see that even the people who received the chronological feed spend more time on Facebook than the average person, and the people in the control group, so the people who get a perfectly normal Facebook experience actually spends 73% more time on the platform than the average users. Since the control group received, as it were, the placebo, this cannot be due to the experimental manipulation. So what we see here is quite simply that the people that decided, that consented to participate in the experiments, are apparently much more active on Facebook than the people who did not participate in the experiment. This makes sense. These people are more likely to have seen the invitation. These people are more likely to have logged in during these periods. And these people are presumably also more likely to trust Facebook and participate in the experiments. If we look at the actions that people perform, so the engagements, we see that both in Facebook and Instagram, the people in the chronological feeds like fewer posts and they comment less on posts, and we see the same in Instagram. So we conclude from these figures is that quite clearly disabling the algorithmic feeds makes the Facebook or Instagram experience less interesting. People spend less time there, and the time they spend there, the exposures they get, are less likely to actually lead to a like or a comment. So apparently people are also less engaged by the things that they do see on the platform. Next, let's look at where those exposures come from. We see in the algorithmic feed, so in the normal experience, the majority of your exposures comes from your friends. So those are the people you mutually follow. And a little bit less than half comes from groups and pages. Interestingly, chronological feeds, there's much less content from your friends and more content from groups and pages. So what you see is that apparently the algorithm actually boosts the post from your friends at the expense of the post from groups or pages. We see the same a little bit on Instagram, although it's less pronounced, because on Instagram, also in the vanilla experience and the algorithmic feeds, most of the content actually comes from people you follow but don't follow you back, and only a small part of the content comes from mutual follows. This is boosted a little bit by the algorithm, so we see that in the chronological feeds there is more content from people you follow but don't follow you back, and there's a little bit less content from mutual follows. If we look at the bottom part of these figures, we can see that the average percentage of what your network creates, what your network posts, how much of that you see, actually goes down for all the categories. So you see fewer of the things posted by your friends, your groups, and your pages, presumably because you just spend less time on the platform with the chronological feeds. But especially the content from your friends is almost half the percentage that you see, while the percentage of the content from the groups is almost the same. And we see a little bit the same direction on the Instagram side. So let's have a look at what it means to the content that you receive. So what you actually see on those platforms. And let's focus especially on the Facebook here in the left-hand side of the graph. So you can see in yellow what you would see with the algorithmic feeds, and on blue what you can see with the chronological feeds. So what you can basically see here is that, for example, the proportion of the feed that has political contents is higher when you get the chronological feed. So that means that the algorithm apparently demotes political contents. It prefers non-political contents, because if you switch on the algorithm, you see less political contents. So what are the total effects of the algorithm? You see less political content. You see more content from cross-cutting sources. So if you're very liberal, that means you see more content from very conservative people, and the other way around. Interestingly, also see more content from like-minded sources. So if you're liberal, you see more liberal content. So interestingly, you see both more cross-cutting and more like-minded content. And of course, as a consequence, you see less moderate or mixed contents. So we do see that the algorithm indeed steers you towards either your in-group or, as it were, the enemy, and it decreases the amount of moderate content you get. You also get less political news, which makes sense. You get less political content in total. You interestingly also get less untrustworthy news. So the algorithm here apparently does a good job of steering you away from untrustworthy contents. And you get a little bit more uncivil content and a tiny bit more content with slur words. And I guess especially the uncivil content here also makes sense, as we see that the algorithm sort of boosts posts that are more likely to lead to engagements. And so they want you to see things that are from people that you totally disagree with, or things from people that you agree with, at the expense of seeing posts that are more moderate, and they like you to see posts that are more uncivil, because presumably it also triggers engagements. So let's look at the experimental effects on polarization and related variables. We've seen that the algorithm steers you away from moderate sources towards cross-cutting and like-minded sources. So in a way you could expect that maybe the algorithm indeed causes polarization. So you could hope that disabling the algorithm might actually lower polarization. What you see here is a graphical representation of the regression. And the way to read it is that every dot is basically the point estimates of the coefficients, and the horizontal line is the confidence interval around this estimate of the effects. So what you see here is that for both effective polarization and issue polarization, there's actually no significant effect either with Facebook or Instagram, because the estimates of the parameters are pretty close to zero, and the confidence interval contains the zero line here, so we are not 95% sure, as it were, that the effect is bigger than zero. And in fact, if you look at the whole graph, you see that actually none of these things have effects. So there's no effect on election knowledge, news knowledge, political participation, or turnout. The only thing that you see is that if you receive the chronological feed, you are a lot less active on the platform. Which kind of makes sense because we already saw that people are less active in the platform in total. So it also makes sense they're less politically engaged on the platform. They also have a bunch of secondary hypotheses, and also there you see hardly any effects. The only thing you see a strong effect on is here on the partisan news clicks. So apparently people are stimulated to click more partisan news. That probably makes sense because this partisan news is more likely to be in your groups and pages, which are demoted by the algorithm, so they are boosted, as it were, in a chronological feeds, and also because the algorithm gives you more political content in general. And that could both explain why people click more on partisan news, while you don't see any of the effects for any of these other things that they measured. So let's move to the second paper. The second paper has the same setup, only here instead of disabling the algorithm, they disable the reshares. That means that the people in the experimental group do not see any of the reshares from the people or pages or groups that they follow. We see here, if you look at the time spent on the platform, a little bit the same thing as we saw in the previous experiments. So overall, the people in the experiments are a lot more active on the platform, right? So that even the people in the control group spend 73% more time on the platform, just as with the previous one. But the people in the experimental group, so they don't see the reshares, they spend a little bit less time on the platform, 64% compared to 73%, but the effect is a lot less pronounced than disabling the algorithm. We can also see that it reduces the clicks a little bit, it reduces the reactions a little bit, and the comments a little bit, and the reshares a little bit. So what it means is that similar to disabling the algorithm, disabling the reshares makes the platform less engaging. You spend less time on the platform and you engage less with the platform. Also similarly, you see that disabling the reshares means that you get actually less posts from your friends. So apparently your friends were the people that are resharing contents compared to posts from groups and pages. Those are apparently putting out more original content. And we can see here that it also means that you see a little bit less of the content from your friends. So what does this do with the content you see? And again, this is similar to the graph from disabling the algorithm. So we see here that if you don't get any reshares, you actually see less political contents. What that means is that apparently your reshares were more likely to be political compared to the original posts. You also get less cross-cutting and less like-minded sources at the expense of more moderate sources. So in this sense, the effect of not getting reshares is very similar to the effect of not getting the algorithmic feeds, although the effect is less pronounced than in the previous graph. You also get less political news if you don't get any reshares. So here again, apparently the political news very often comes through the reshares that you get. And also you get less untrustworthy sources, so apparently the reshares that you were getting were more likely to be untrustworthy. So what are the experimental effects here? And here, rather than presenting them visually, they present them in a table, which I guess is a little bit of a shame. I like visuals. But the most important thing to look at here, of course, is the P column here, and we can see that almost nothing here is significant at all. The only thing that is significant is the end is the news knowledge. So we can see, if you look at the effect here, that's not getting the reshares actually means that you have less news knowledge, both at the sample level, this is the sample average treatment effects, and also when they reweight this back to the population level, and it's still significant also there, but not if you adjust it for multiple comparisons. And what this means is that it's sort of standard practice that if you're testing so many hypotheses on the same data sets, you really want to adjust your p-values, because if you don't, then just by pure chance one of your p-values might be significant, and if you adjust it for that, then also here the population average treatment effect becomes insignificant, because this number here is bigger than 0.05, although at the sample level it does stay significant. So what do we get from this? What we get from this is that, I guess similar as to disabling the algorithm, there is no effect at all on effective polarization, no effect on election knowledge, and there might actually be a slightly negative effect on news knowledge, which could make sense because you spend less time on the platform and you get less political news if you disable the reshares. So what do we conclude from both experiments? They're both actually quite nice experiments. They're impressively large, of course, with 20,000 participants. They're done in collaboration with Meta, which made it easy to connect the people to the contents. The experimental results are maybe not so interesting because there were no experimental effects on polarization. But what I thought is very interesting from these papers is that that sort of shows how the algorithm and how the resharing affordance actually affect your experience. And we see that disabling either of those makes the platform a lot less attractive, especially if you get the chronological feeds. It just becomes less of an interesting platform. So in that sense, the algorithm does a good job of making sure you get interesting content, or at least content that make you stay on the platform and engage with the platform. And also by disabling either affordance, you get more moderate content, and you get less content both that agrees with, that you agree with, and less content that is cross-cutting, so content completely on the opposite side of the political spectrum. So both the resharing feature and the algorithm do actually steer you away from moderate content towards more extreme contents. If you disable reshares, you actually get less political content and less trustworthy content. So the reshares are apparently relatively more political. But especially if you disable the chronological feed, you see that you actually get more political content. So the algorithm apparently steers you away from political content, presumably towards the more personal updates from your friends. As I said, we did not see any experimental effects on polarization, which probably kind of makes sense. Polarization is pretty ingrained. If you are now heavily polarized, like what is the chance of being less polarized in a couple of months, especially during an election campaign, and especially here because the people that participated in the experiments were already much more active on Facebook than the average Facebook user. So probably the people that have already spent a lot of time on the platform, if they were going to be polarized, they are already polarized. If they are not going to be polarized, they are not polarized now. So even if maybe the platform is responsible or partly responsible for polarizing people, it is not so likely that disabling the algorithm for a couple of months would actually lead to people being less polarized, and that's also the results that we see here.